This is another response to Varioblast's Dogfecker challenge, as I'm calling it. Probably the fifth, I guess, in this series. I've still got a couple to do, I think. But just to remind us where we are with this, in Varioblast's video, which was a response to one of Gary Do Not God's videos, he said a lot of things actually, but two of the things that I'm really picking up on. Firstly, he announced it as a kind of a video that was aimed at Gary's subscribers, not at Gary himself, and I'm one of Gary's subscribers too, so I regard that video as aimed at me. And also it was, amongst, as I say, a lot of other things, it did issue a very specific challenge, and the challenge was, why would anybody fuck a dog? Great challenge, really, nothing wrong with that as a question, so I'm just finding ways to respond to that. Where I want to go with this one is to, I've talked a little bit about Freud and about neuroscience in the previous ones, and evolutionary biology. And I thought I'd have a go at Marx today, Karl Marx. Again, he's a theorist who is really out of fashion, which makes him all the more interesting as far as I'm concerned. And I want to start with Marx and then move into somebody else who's perhaps less well known. And the bit of Marx that I'm thinking about specifically is this very famous quotation that Marx had in Das Kapital, where he said, a man's consciousness, I beg your pardon, the structure of the world, or something like that, the structure of the world is not dependent on a man's consciousness, but a man's consciousness is dependent on the structure of the world. And what he meant basically by that is that, you know, the world isn't the way it is because of these autonomous agents of ourselves going out there and making it that way. It's the other way around, he says. You know, we are shaped and formed by the effects of the world around us, and particularly in Marx, of course, the way that capital circulates in that world, ownership and ownership of the means of production, who owns the cash and who provides the labour. It's that kind of an analysis. Now again, I'm oversimplifying for clarity, and this isn't a set of theories I entirely subscribe to, although I do have some sympathies with Marx in many areas. But I don't want to take on Marx directly. I want to move on a bit to a theorist who was a Marxist, and this is a chap called Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser. Fascinating set of ideas he had. He was writing in the 60s and 70s, I guess. And the particular bit of Althusser that I'm thinking about specifically, it's two things really. I'll do the first bit. So the first bit is kind of drawing on what I was just saying about Marx, but basically he developed that to a more complex analysis, where he says that, you know, people form themselves, become, you know, whatever we are to start with. You know, we form themselves out of that starting point, dependent upon what he calls discourse, the range of discourses, he says, in societies. And in fact, the term he uses is hailing. He says we're hailed by a plethora of discourses. And the idea is that you come into the world as a relatively unformed mass, relatively unformed set of potentials. But we come into the world that's already in progress. You know, it's like joining the fast lane of a motorway off the slip road. Everybody's already moving, everything's in place already. You know, the world is, you are cast into the world, you know what I mean, and it's already in motion, and you've got to try and catch up with it. And the way you do that, he says, is that you look around you and you're kind of summoned into being by these different discourses. And there's different discourses according to all the different roles that you play in life. So there's a particular discourse appropriate to what it is to be a son, for example. And there's another one about what it's like to be a father. And another one about what it's like to be a worker. And another one to do with being a consumer or a certain kind of producer. And there's dozens and dozens of these discourses, or a woman or a man. There's dozens of these discourses, he says. And when we're kind of coming into the world and looking around for what we are, we're summoned by these. And they come forth as we need them. So when you have children, you know, become a father, for example, the models of what it is to be a father kind of call you to them. They don't like naturally arise from within you. You don't naturally learn how to talk gruffly and talk about tools and all that kind of stuff. The models already exist out there in the shape of, you know, your own father or Family Guy father, or Bill Cosby father, or all these fathers on television, in the media, in films. All these fathers out there act as a discourse, a kind of set of conversations which pull you towards them and which give you a feeling of, oh, right, that's what it's like to be a dad, or that's what it's like to be a son, or that's what it's like to be a worker in this industry, or that's what it's like to be a man, or that's what it's like to be a woman. And it's comforting, and it feels normal and natural when you get there, because all of that uncertainty disappears. And of course you're pulled in all sorts of different directions, so it isn't that you're pulled in one consistent way. You're constantly held in tension, if you like stretched between these discourses, and that's the shape of your soul, that's the shape of your personality, that's who you are, that strange distorted shape that you're pulled into by these discourses, by these patterns of discourse. Okay, so that's the first thing about that. And how it relates to dog fecking, well, that's a bit more complex, because of course there isn't, or is there? There isn't the discourse of dog fecking right now, which hails you towards it. But let's see if I can imagine how there could be. Because the second thing about Althusser, which is quite interesting, that I want to bring up here, is the relationship between that process I've just talked about of individual formation of personality and the workings of the state. Because of course in Marx the functioning of the state is very important. It keeps things in place, it's a dynamic system, but it's also a kind of machine that keeps the product producing and consumption of the model all keep working. And that's the same in Althusser. So how does the state function in maintaining these discourses that keep us all in shape? And in Althusser, it's what he calls the ideological state apparatuses. Ideological state apparatuses. And they're things like the police force, the military, the health service, education, the family, religion plays a big role. All of those kind of civic institutions which organise our lives for us and produce things like the economy, produce things like town planning, produce things like bureaucracies, all the kind of stuff that you live your lives in and which institutionalise social relationships. In Althusser, that's the ideological state apparatus. And those things legislate what discourses are allowed and what discourses aren't allowed, what people are allowed to do, to realise themselves and which aren't. So, for example, in some parts of the world it's legal to marry someone of your gender, in other parts it's not. So in some states the discourse of what constitutes being a spouse includes that, and some it doesn't. Yeah, so you can imagine there's a different kind of hailing process, stretched and shaped in a slightly different way in those societies. But as far as I know, there is not currently a state with an ideological state apparatus which contains dog fecking. But since this is just a kind of hypothetical exercise, I don't think it's difficult to imagine that. I mean, we do live in a world, right now, for example, in which there are states, there are societies, there are cultures which contain things like female genital mutilation. I mean, that happens in a lot of states around the world, yeah, and circumcision, and until relatively recently, foot binding, and the shaping of heads, and the chiseling of teeth, and scarification. These are these cultural practices, as we call them, are absolutely part of the ideological state apparatuses of those cultures, of those societies, of those states. And personally, if if states exist in which, cutting off a woman's clitoris and cutting back her labia is an acceptable practice, I think it's not hard to imagine a state which contains an ideological practice involving some kind of weird, semi-religious, semi-cultural sacrament involving fecking a dog, quite honestly. Yeah, so that's Louis Althusser.